For the Ursula jacket you'll need about 50 cm to a meter of fabric depending on the size. First of all, take your front facing and iron 2 pieces of violin onto the corners. Then pin the facing onto the lining of your fabric. So all the way around. You can use a big stitch for this just to hold it into place and make working with it so much easier. Now you will snip into the corners, not a centimeter, about 0.7, fold in from the point that you've cut in and pin this facing all the way around. You might have to snip in the curves so you can get them nicely folded under. When you've done that for both of them, you want to stitch it all into place, very close to the edge, all the way around, and you've created a really lovely facing that will be visible from the outside. Next, we're going to close the center back of what is going to be the collar. 1 centimeter seam allowance. Once you've sewn that, you need to snip the curves to make sure that it'll turn easily. And you're going to iron them apart. Do that on the lining and also do it on the main fabric. Now we're going to put the facings on the back that we've cut out, the contrast fabric. Again, we'll just turn in the edge and we'll pin it into place. This is the easiest way of doing it and ensures that it goes in the right place. Place it under the sewing machine and stitch close to the edge all the way across. Now we're going to do the top exactly the same. Just turn in the edge, pin it into place and sew it. Now we're ready for the shoulder seams. Place your front and your back together and pin. What you will find on both the lining and the shell fabric is that the back is slightly larger than the front, and that is meant to be that way. That's so the curve that is quite naturally in your back, or a child's back anyway, has got enough fabric. And here you can see it again quite clearly that you've got a little bit more. Ease it in. Next, you're going to iron apart those seams on both of the lining and the shell fabric. And next we're going to close our darts. Just mark the back, put a pin in there so it can't go anywhere. Pin from the center back to the front. And there should be a tip of about 4 centimeters below the point you have cut. And you mark that with an erasable pen, and you do the same on the other side. You pin it so it fits nicely. Measure your 3.5 or 4 centimeters down and pin the rest. Now we're going to sew the dart from one end to the other. Reverse stitch at the beginning. You can of course just leave the stitches loose and then put a knot into it if that's easier for you, and sew all the way around. Make sure that you ease the fabric in. The next step is to snip the curves, so to allow the easy turning, and you also might want to snip back, trim back the seam allowances so that it's nice and flat. Now repeat this step on the lining. Again, mark the center, pin it, mark where your dart has to go to on either side, sew it. Make sure that none of your seam allowances fold over while you're doing it. So you can see me here using a little pin, easing the fabric in. Now you're getting to the end of it, reverse stitch, and you're ready to iron your darts. Iron them towards the collar, nice and flat. Now we're going to close the side seams. Again, it's a centimetre seam allowance, so you do the same on the lining and on the shell fabric. This is a little trick. You don't need to necessarily take everything off and then cut the threads off and then put the next piece under. Just let them run into the machine after each other. Again, we want to iron the seams apart on the lining and the shell fabric. And now we can join both pieces together. It's very quick, as you can see, and we start from where the insert is going to go and we go all the way around. And here you can see that's where the insert starts, so straight across there where you can see me put the pin, that's where we begin, and we go to the other end all the way around. Pin your seams into place so that while you're stitching they can fold over. And there it is pinned. Put it under the sewing machine and go all the way around. Centimetre seam allowance. When you get to the collar part, I would suggest that you actually reduce the stitch length slightly so that it can't come apart. That always works really well. You can see me doing it here. No, actually you can't. Now I'm going to stitch back the seam allowance. So you take your seam allowance, fold it towards the facing underneath it, and then you stitch on the facing on that lovely contrast lining close to the edge. You can only go to roughly where the curve starts. You won't be able to go any further, but it helps you with the ironing, and you can leave this step out if you want to. If you can't do this and it's a bit too complicated for you, then just leave it out. Now you can turn the jacket inside out. And press it. When you're pressing, you should always iron from the side that will be visible. And roll the fabric forwards and backwards. You can use your fingers there to ease it out and make sure that you can see none of the outer fabric, the shell fabric here, because you don't want that to peek out. Now it's ironed and ready to go. We next need to attach the collar. It's still loose, so an easy trick to do this is to go inside and find your seam allowances here, turn them towards each other, just grab them and then stitch them into place. Just a few stitches. You can do this by hand if you like. You could even do it from the outside, just placing it on top of each other and then going through the seam if this is not easy enough for you. So that's another way around it. But this stitch is quite easy and it's not visible from the outside, so it's a good one. And you can now see that they're attached to each other and they won't come apart. Next we're going to place our insert inside the jacket. To do that, we first want to do a narrow rolled edge hem on the bottom, so I am just putting a pin in the beginning so I can get it under and put the first stitch in. And then I pull it from the back. That's actually quite important, and there's quite a lot of tension from the front as well. I don't pin any of this, I just guide it in. You'll actually find that pinning makes it harder. It takes a bit of practice to do it just with your fingers, but do give it a go. It's much easier when you've done it a few times. It'll be easier than pinning it, and of course it's much faster. Now we need to put a gather thread in, so I actually backstitch that at the beginning of my seam and not at the back, so you can see them both together. One is foot width is apart from the other one, and I can now pull the top threads. You don't want to pull the lower ones, yeah, decide which ones you're going to pull, lower or top threads, and that's what you pull. If you pull both of them, it'll just lock the stitches in and you'd have to start again. Just put a good amount of gathers in, and now you're going to place it so that the narrow rolled edge hem is actually visible. Fold it over so it lies on one side first, and you can see it here. I'm doing it very slowly. Lift up the fabric and you're basically pinning it to the edge where your facing starts. Now at the top you only want to sew about 1 centimeter off the top edge there, so you pin it and you want to sew that into place now. Your next step is to obviously do the same on the other side. You pin it on, put it into place, and sew just 1 centimeter off the edge, and you can see it here quite clearly. Then you want to snip right into the corner of where you've sewn to release the fabric when you turn it. Do the same on both sides, obviously. And now you can see that that opens out really nicely. You need to arrange your gathers now. I would secure them on one side to the right width, and then you can sort them out and make sure that they look really good and they're evenly spaced all the way across. I would always work this from the side that you've already stitched down, so not from the side where the gathers are, because you can see exactly where you need to go. You need to go across that corner and hold it all in, otherwise you get an edge that frays and that would not be very nice. So sew from that side and that will make it perfect. Backwards and forwards at the end and the beginning of your seam. Really catch that little edge there. And now it's nicely in. What you want to do now is attach your facing, your lining. And to do that, you just basically turn the facing over the seam you've just done, and you will be sewing exactly to the same point. So you can do that from the side where you can see it, or either side really, but I would suggest you sew it from the side where you've actually cut the corner, so you can see the point exactly to which you have to go. sew it, fold your seam allowance under, make sure that it's nice and neat and nice and flat. And when you pull this apart now, cut off the seam allowance first, yes, snip it a little bit, and now you want to turn that inside out and pull it, and you're getting a really nicely cased in insert. That looks lovely. You do the same on the other side. Again, you fold your insert and your lining on top of each other. You pin again right to that point where you've already sewn, and you stitch right to that point. Cut back the seam allowance, always trim so that it's flatter. Pull it, and again the other side is done. Now we need to still release the facing. So you go back inside and you snip exactly to the sewing into that corner again, the same way really that you just did before, just to release it so it turns easier. To both sides. And there you have it, it's nice and flat now. Next you're going to turn in your facing, and you're going to place it just above your stitching line, because we're going to stitch this from the outside, and that way it will catch. And there's going to be a little stitch there, so we're sewing it now from the outside close to the edge, and I would use a stitch that's, you know, not too small, maybe a 3.0. I actually found that I did it a little bit too tight here, so I had to move my pins back out, go across. Reverse stitch at the end, and it's perfectly in. Now we are almost finished. Jacket looking really good, but we still need to do the sleeves, and to get that right I want to pin that area here, and then I want to stitch it into place first of all with a large stitch so it can't move anywhere before I finally put my sleeve in. Now we're going to do the sleeves. First we do the cuffs. You've got a lining and you have got the shell fabric. Now I'm actually using the same fabric. Important thing is to create a pair. So where you snipped and marked where you have the front, that should now match the bit that's just under the sewing machine, and if you do that it'll come out just perfect. Once we've joined them, we want to cut back the seam allowance on the facing. Open out my little cuff, seam allowance towards the facing, and we're going to top stitch the facing down. Do that on both, and join the seam. Now that seam will be a little bit tight, so it's very important that we are going to snip it and also trim any seam allowance back so that it's nice and flat. You can then iron that little seam apart if you like. I tend to not do that, I just do it with my fingers. Arrange the cuff nicely. What you will find is that because we used the top stitching, that they no longer are edge to edge. So you want to sew around with a large stitch the edge of the cuff, and then we're going to trim the excess off. Next we're going to do the sleeve. Join the seam of the sleeve, and then if you haven't got an overlocker, this is where you need to zigzag the edge to stop it from fraying. And next we're going to put in our gather stitches. Now they need to go around the head of the sleeve, and you want to put 2 in, one fairly close to the edge and the other one foot width apart, because we want a centimetre seam allowance, and that will sit just nicely in the middle between those stitches. You also want to put a gather stitch at the lower end of your sleeve, and you've already snipped that. So secure the stitch on one side and not the other. Repeat. And now you pull the top threads until they don't want to go anymore. It's usually the right amount. On some of the smaller sizes, H3 and 4, thinking I needed to release the stitches a bit, or the other sizes, that's fine. Now when you put the cuff on, the cuff actually rolls from the inside to the outside. So when you pin it on, you need to have the top stitching where the seam allowance is stitched back showing, and it sits on the wrong side, so you're actually having the right side onto the wrong side, so that looks a little bit wrong, but it does turn out right. So make sure you get it the right way around. Stitch it into place all the way around the lower edge of the cuff. And next you may want to zigzag that edge, or you can overlock it. Then it gets turned upwards, and we want to stitch the seam allowance back here again as well. Pull it all apart and just go over it. Now this stitch again is not necessary. I don't always do it, but it actually, you know, if you have got the time and you want to do it really nicely, then I would do that. Now we need to make the bow. Fold over the fabric and sew a seam, leaving a gap in the middle through which we can turn our bow inside out. Open out the seam and now sew across the top and the lower edge. Turn your little bow inside out. Move all the edges out with a pin. And gather through the middle. You can just do that with a thread by hand. We're now going to wrap around another piece of contrast fabric. I haven't got footage of that, but it's just simply that pattern piece, and that says tie. So you wrap it around, you pin at the back, and you're good to go to sew that onto your actual cuff. You would need to put it slightly more forward to the front than the back, just by about half a centimetre or centimetre. Then you stitch through the tie back on either side of the tie, and it's done. You want to attach the cuff to the side seam, so you just stitch straight through there to hold it in place. If you found it difficult to do the bow, you can also just stitch the bow into place at this point with a sewing machine. That makes it a little bit easier to wrap the tie around. and then the step is exactly the same as before. Now place both sleeves opposite each other, make sure you get it into the same place, maybe put a pin in there and then stitch it into place. Right hand side of the tie, left hand side of the tie, and you're ready to gather your sleeve. Now the first thing I do is I just go in with my arm to the right side that I need, so I know I get it right. I put a pin into the side seam and I put another one at the sleeve head to make sure it's in the right position, and then rolling the sleeve fabric over the edge, what you do is you pin it in about 5 or 6 centimeters off the sleeve head. Make sure you do it nice and loose, and once you've done that you can gather the sleeve head and arrange your gathers nicely. When it's all gathered and it looks really good, you might want to check from the outside that it looks good. You're ready to sew it into place. And again we've got a 1 centimeter seam allowance here that we need to keep to. And once we've done that, all that remains to be done is to overlock the sleeve. And you can do that with the overlocker, and if you haven't got one you need to zigzag it over. And that's basically your jacket finished. You can put a button in as well, so a buttonhole needs to be placed roughly on the same height as where you've got your underarm. You could cover a button and put it into place, and there we go, we have the finished jacket. Now good luck with your jacket, and I'll see you next time.